Today, 24th April, I'm going to start the video with a summary of the situation on the battle lines in Ukraine, because it's clear that the situation is now developing very rapidly and in a way which I suspect is going to shape the outcome of what will happen in Ukraine over the course of the summer and perhaps for the rest of the year. I should say that for the moment at least, there's been surprisingly little commentary or discussion or reporting about what's actually going on the battlefronts in Ukraine. The British media has basically stopped writing about this topic. There was an article which appeared yesterday in The Guardian, which did briefly touch on the fact that the Russians had made significant advance, an 8-kilometer advance west of Avdiivka, but which provided very few details, though Ocheretino was mentioned in that article. But elsewhere in the broadsheet newspapers in Britain, the Times, the Telegraph, the Financial Times, you wouldn't know anything about any of this, nor is the BBC writing about it, writing or talking about it. And I get the sense that the same is true in the United States. Now, one possible reason is that the fighting has been taking place in relatively small places. Ocheretino had a population, a pre-war population of over 3,000 people. So perhaps it's a stretch to call it a village. Maybe more correctly, it should be called a small town. But obviously, we're not talking about any big place. Novo-Bakhmutivka, which, as we'll see in a moment, as we'll discuss in a moment, it looks as if the Russians have captured, is a small place, much smaller place. Solovyova, which is another village to the west of Novo-Bakhmutivka, appears to be smaller still. And all the other places that we've been talking about recently, Umanske, Yasnobrodovka, Netailovo, all of these, Berdichi, all of these are small villages. And well, Krasnogorovka is bigger, and Chasov Yar is also bigger. These are indeed small towns. Chasov Yar, 12,000 people. Krasnogorovka, 14,000 people. But none of them can be said to be big or important places in and of themselves. So it's relatively straightforward to basically ignore what is happening in these places and to talk instead about other things. For example, the votes in Congress, about which I will come to shortly, and the general news, and all those things, rather than discuss what's actually happening on the battlefronts. But of course, if you do what some of us have been doing for more than 2 years now, heartless, thankless, and joyless task though it is, and going close to the events and following more closely what's going on the battlefronts, one can sense a significant change. I spoke yesterday about how it seems that Ukrainian brigades, are increasingly refusing to follow orders. There are reports this morning of public prosecutions within Ukraine of officers and soldiers who are straightforwardly disobeying orders. So we're getting more reports of that kind. But we're also getting more evidence, more reports that are pointing to a gathering collapse of Ukrainian defenses and a gathering of Ukrainian defenses in the Avdiivka area, with reports that Ukrainian troops are starting to flee, to evacuate, even from positions which, remarkably, are not yet, it seems, even under attack. And that is a indicator that things clearly are not going at all well. So let's turn first of all to what exactly is happening in all of these places. Firstly, it's been confirmed. It was confirmed last night and early this morning that fighting has indeed continued in Ocheretina. In other words, the fact that all of these various Ukrainian brigades that I was talking about, the 115th Brigade, the 47th Mechanized Brigade, would not take up positions in Ocheretino, well, that has completely disorganized Ukrainian defenses in the village, or small town, perhaps we should call it. But it doesn't mean that there aren't actual Ukrainian defenders in some places. But over the course of yesterday and this morning, we learned of further advances by Russian infantry inside Ocheretino. And it is looking as if Ukrainian defense in Ocheretino, disorganized and chaotic as it appears to be, is collapsing fast. It's likely, I'm not saying this for certain, but it's likely that Ocheretino will come fully under Russian control at some point within the next couple of hours, or at the most days. And it seems, there are reports at least, that the much smaller village of Novobakhmutivka, immediately to the south of Ocheretino, has already been captured by the Russians, apparently with minimal resistance from the Ukrainian defenders. And it also seems that the Russians have probably captured this further village of Solovyovo, which lies immediately to the west of Novobakhmutivka. So it looks as if we're having a rapid breakdown of Ukrainian defenses in this area. However, there are other reports. There are reports this morning from Russian sources that Ukrainian troops are also now retreating from other places as well. Places which, as I said, have not so far come under attack. And one of them is a village called Novo Alexandrivka, which is located to the northwest of Ocheretino, which, as I said, the Russians have not so far apparently even approached. And anyway, Russian officials have increasingly taken to speaking about Ukrainian troops fleeing, that this has been the word that we've been getting about the way in which Ukrainian troops have been responding to the situation around in this area of the battlefronts. So, a chaotic and disorganized situation with apparently Ukrainian brigades refusing to follow orders, and Ukrainian soldiers and military units making decisions for themselves and pulling back from villages that the Russians are either attacking or perhaps not attacking for the moment, but which they might attack at some point soon. And there are, by the way, reports that the Russians have also moved forward and have cut the road T0511 from Ocheretino all the way to Konstantinovka, this town located to the west, southwest of Chasov Yar, that they've cut that road. I'm not sure how significant that is. But anyway, they seem to be advancing there, and they seem to be in the process, well on the way, to capturing also the settlement of Novokalinova to the east of Ocheretino, and they seem to be going well forward to advancing in those places as well. So it looks like some kind of Ukrainian collapse. Now, there was a very interesting account of this battle, which I think I read on Slavyangrad, this indispensable Telegram channel, writes things from the Russian perspective, though I believe it is not actually based in Russia, which, as I've discussed many times, is not only a very good and reliable reporter of what is going on in the war, but is a very effective site aggregator, and which also provides very interesting and useful analysis of some of the battles. And what I saw in this report is that one of the things that has led to this Ukrainian attack, to collapse, or rather this gathering Ukrainian attack collapse, is that the Russians acted in ways that the Ukrainians did not expect. The Ukrainians had assumed that, as many people I remember were saying, what the Russians would do before they made a major attempt to capture Ocheretino is that they would clear the positions on the west and east of the railway line leading into Ocheretino. That the railway line, the railway connection, the Russians had advanced into Ocheretino along the railway, that the area of the Russian advance was essentially a narrow funnel, and the assumption was that in order to secure their flanks first, the Russians would first take steps to capture Novobakhmutivka and perhaps Novokalinova, or at any rate would act to clear the fields to the west and east of the railway. So the result was that the Ukrainians positioned troops, their forces, mostly in Novobakhmutivka, expecting that that was the place that the Russians would attack first. And what happened instead was that the Russians seized the initiative and bypassed the Ukrainian troops in Novobakhmutivka and stormed Ocheretino instead. And this totally unexpected advance disorganized and shocked the Ukrainians, and is what explains why Ocheretino itself was not as heavily defended as it might have been, and it is what led, in effect, to the collapse that we're now seeing. Well, that's very interesting, and it suggests that whoever is the officer on the Russian side who is in overall charge of things on this part of the battlefronts, that he's an officer with considerable drive and initiative. He's someone who's prepared to take risks, but obviously calculated risks, and on this occasion it's paid off. It could be, of course, that the officer in question is General Mudvichev himself, who is the group of forces commander in the area, though perhaps more plausibly it's the brigade commander whose task it was to capture Ocheretino itself. In other words, someone further down the military hierarchy. But anyway, whoever it was, as I said, took risks. There's that famous slogan of the British Special Air Service Regiment, who dares wins. Apparently, this person took that to heart, stormed Ocheretino, and has, as a result, disorganized the entire Ukrainian defense line, bringing the whole situation into a state of collapse. Now, there doesn't seem to be anything that the Ukrainians can do for the moment that look like they're going to stabilize the situation. Ocheretino, Novobakhmutivka, Novokalinova, Keramik, and Solovyova all look like they're about to fall, at least, or look like they're going to fall, and probably will do so at some point within the next few hours or days. We got conclusive confirmation today from the Ukrainians themselves that further south, the Russians are now in full and complete control of Semenyovka, this village immediately to the south of Berdichi. It seems that some kind of fighting is still going on around Berdichi, but whoever amongst the Ukrainians is defending there is now at very, very great risk, as I've discussed many times, of being trapped with all lines of retreat cut off. Perhaps they are already cut off, but anyway, the long battle of Berdichi appears to be coming to an end. With the Russians in control of Ocheretino, the Ukrainian defenses in Umansko, Yasnobrodovka, and Netalevo are certain to collapse as well. So we are looking at a complete blowout, a decisive Russian win, which will probably be consolidated within the next few days. Now, it could be, of course, that the Ukrainians will find some force to pull together and to send urgently to the lines, and which will mount some kind of big counterattack, and which perhaps will retake Ocheretino or achieve something like that. But for the moment, we're not seeing any sign of that. And I have to say, that would be very much contrary to the direction of events as we've seen them play out at the moment. And we're getting reports, by the way, from other battlefronts, and they're pointing to some similar stories. Now, the 79th Brigade, which is the Ukrainian brigade that was defending Novomikhailivka, which the Russians captured or were confirmed to have captured a few days ago, is now complaining bitterly about the overall military situation. They're saying that the Russians are able to advance because the ground has hardened. That enables the Russians to mount mechanized attacks with tanks and armored vehicles on a scale that the Ukrainians have never up to now seen. They also complain that the Russian infantry has now found an effective response to the problem caused by the FPV drones. Some weeks ago, there was an incident in Chasiv Yar where the Russians were able to land infantry in positions close to Chasiv Yar on motorbikes. They were able to drive across the fields in cross-country motorbikes and land infantry, and they moved so fast that the FPV drones weren't able to target them. Now, I said at the time that this seemed to me like a tactic that the Russians were probably refining in order to assist the infantry to overcome this problem of the FPV drones, that the Russians had understood for some time that FPV drones would mount a significant problem for armored vehicles, though there are all kinds of ways that that problem can be suppressed, which I'll probably come to in a later program. There's an awful lot of discussion about this, by the way, in the Russian media space, but that's for another day. But anyway, one way of getting infantry across a field fast and avoiding the problem of FPV drones is to put them on motorcycles. And it was tried out in Chasiv Yar, and apparently that the success of that in close to Chasiv Yar has led to the same being done in other places as well. And the 79th Brigade, a very angry brigade at the moment, bitter at the fact that it has been pushed out of Novomikhailivka, complaining noisily about the failures of command that caused that to happen. Anyway, they're complaining that the Russians are advancing fast, that they're now attacking Konstantinovka. This is another place called Konstantinovka. This is a village, a big village or small town to the west of Novomikhailivka. Anyway, that they're attacking Konstantinovka and have apparently actually entered this village, that they're doing the same with another village between Konstantinovka and Novomikhailivka called Paraskovievka. And they're able to do that partly because armored units are able to move across the fields, but also because Russian infantry storming positions are able to dash across the fields incredibly fast on motorcycles. So we see how the situation evolves and how the Russians are evolving, developing tactically, and how effective this is. By the way, I ought to say there's lots of talk in the West about Russian troops lacking initiative, the fact that they don't have good small unit commanders because of the Russian military's supposed lack of non-commissioned officers. Those of us who follow the war closely can see that that is absolutely not true. There is film after film after film of Russian infantry, small groups of infantry, carrying out these kind of storming attacks and operations, and they lack nothing in drive, initiative, courage, and resolution when they press home these sort of attacks. By the way, the same is true of the Ukrainians also, just to make that clear. So no sign that, there's this weakness in small unit leadership that people are talking about. Anyway, the long and the short of it is, Novomikhailivka has fallen. The Russians look like they're in the process of storming the villages immediately to the west of Novomikhailivka, Paraskovievka, and Konstantinovka, cutting the supply lines to Vuglidar in the south. And the Russians apparently also enlarging their areas of control in the village of Georgievka. Now, yesterday, there was a lengthy report from the Russian Defense Ministry of an address by the Russian Defense Minister, Sergei Shoigu. He often provides reports, updates about the things that have been going on. And he gave us a report about the overall situation on the line of contact on the battlefronts. And he said that the Russian group of forces hold the initiative along the entire line of contact and continue to push the enemy out of the line of contact. Russian servicemen have liberated Pervomaisky, Bogdanovka, and Novomikhailivka as a result of active combat operations. The control zone is being extended in Berdichi and Georgievka. In Berdichi, I suspect the Russians are going to announce at some point over the next few days that this bitterly fought over village has finally been captured. Georgievka, the same. There were all kinds of reports. Dima at the Military Summary channel had the very latest ones in his latest video of how the Russians have now captured what looked to me like a significant part of the remaining part of Georgievka, which was under Ukrainian control. It looks like Ukrainian defense in Georgievka is also now starting to collapse, just saying. And the fact that Shoigu is talking about Berdichi and Georgievka suggests that the Russians expect that these two villages will have passed fully under their control within the next few hours. Anyway, Shoigu then goes on to say, our high combat potential allow us to constantly inflict fire damage on the enemy and prevent the adversary from holding the line of defense. And then he said various other things, which I'm going to discuss later in the program. But he also said pertinently that since the beginning of the special military operation, the Ukrainian military has suffered losses of almost 500,000 troops. Almost 500,000 troops. Of course, that includes dead and severely wounded. It is not just dead, just to make that absolutely clear. But that's the level of losses that he is claiming. By the way, the other day, there was an article in the New York Times which said that the Pentagon now believes that the true level of Russian fatalities over the entire period of the special military operation, in other words, over the course of more than 2 years now, of intense fighting, is 60,000. I think this is probably roughly correct. I saw that Jeff Roberts, who is a historian who's covered many wars and written about wars, feels the same way. It looks consistent with the information that we've had from the Media Zona project, which tracks Russian fatalities by looking at open source information, which I consider reliable. And anyway, this figure of 60,000 for Russian fatalities seems to me to be in the right ballpark. It might be perhaps a little on the high side, but not, I suspect, by very much. Contrast that with the fantastic numbers of hundreds of thousands of dead Russian troops that we get from the Ukrainians, which have been repeated without any qualification or skepticism by Western reporters. Given how intense the fighting has been over the last 2.5 years, I would say that this was a relatively acceptable level of loss. I think that is what the Russians would say. I stress acceptable in military and resource terms, not, of course, in terms of the effect on the families and friends and of the men who were killed themselves. For them, of course, this is each of them. It is a tragedy. But in terms of war and war fighting, it is a kind of level of loss that I think the Russians can take comfortably. And I'm going to say also that the loss rate appears to have declined since the start of the summer of 2023. If we look at the figures published by Media Zona, Russian losses for declined during the period of Ukraine's summer offensive. There was then a jump at the start of the operation against Avdiivka. Then they fell back again. It's likely we're going to get more jumps soon. But anyway, the heaviest losses that the Russians have suffered, for the moment at least, seem to be behind them. Anyway, that's a digression. Let's add that, let's simply point out that Shoigu is talking about confidence that the Russians will be able to break any Ukrainian defense line, and that the Russians, well, the hint here is that the Russians expect that they will take Georgievka and Berdichi under their control also. There's also been information from Chasiv Yar, and it seems that having captured Bogdanovka a couple of days ago, or at least completed the capture of Bogdanovka a couple of days ago, the Russians are now working to capture the hill immediately to the west of Bogdanovka. If this hill is captured, which, by the way, it will be, then the Russians will be able to move on and capture Kalinina, the village just beyond. They'll be able to cross the canal. The micro-district east of the canal is in effect surrounded and is subject to relentless Russian bombing. But with the hill and Kalinina captured, the main battle for Chasiv Yar, the main operation to storm and capture Chasiv Yar, presumably with all these troops that the Russians have waiting in Bakhmut, that battle will no doubt begin in earnest. Now, let's go back again briefly to the Battle of Ocheretino. As I've discussed, this village looks like it's about to be captured by the Russians. I've discussed many times how it lies on top of a significant elevation, a hill. It dominates the surrounding landscape, and the Russians can exploit the advantages that the capture of Ocheretino would give them to carry out all kinds of advances in further directions. The capture of Chasiv Yar, when it happens, which I suspect fairly soon, is going to provide the Russians with the same advantage. And they will be in control of the high ground in two of the most important locations in Donbass. And previously, earlier in the war, back in 2022, when they captured a village or small town called Popaznaya, which was also on the high ground, it led to the quick collapse of Ukrainian defenses in northern Lugansk region and to the fall of the towns of Severodonetsk and Lysychansk. And I have to say, with Chasiv Yar and Ocheretino under Russian control, it's likely that we're going to see outcomes that will probably be at least as dramatic. So anyway, there we go. This is the situation on the battlefronts as of today. What looks like an accelerating collapse of Ukrainian defenses in the Avdiivka area. The Russians acting with increasing boldness, and the Russians poised to capture a whole string of important locations, all preparatory, no doubt, for whatever further offensive is to come. Now, on the topic of Russian offensives, we have now been told that the group of forces north, the one that's located around Kharkiv region, that this is apparently going to go into battle under the symbol N, which is the new symbol that the Russians will adopt. It'll be interesting to see whether they use the Latin or the Cyrillic version of the letter N. Earlier in the war, they were using the Zapad group, the West group, was using the Latin form of the letter Z, or Z, rather than the Cyrillic version. Anyway, we'll see what happens this time. But Dima at the Military Summary channel yesterday identified who he says is the likely commander of Group of Forces North, and he said that it's going to be General Lapin. Now, Lapin has been a general who has been very active on the battlefronts. He's an experienced military officer. He's not been without controversy. He played a key role alongside General Surovikin in the capture of Severodonetsk and Lysychansk in the summer of 2022. He also played an important role in stabilizing the front line following Ukraine's Kharkiv offensive in the autumn of 2022. And he provoked a certain controversy because he actually arranged for, in fact, he actually personally went and collected the Russian garrison that was defending the town of Liman, which was the high watermark of Ukraine's Kharkiv offensive, and he pulled them back. And he came in for some criticism at the time from Ramzan Kadyrov and from Yevgeny Prigozhin, who were very angry, or said they were very angry, about the retreat from Liman. And briefly, Lapin was then recalled, but it was clear that the Russian High Command continued to have great confidence in him. And after a certain period of time in which he was holding posts in Moscow, as I remember, he reappeared on the battlefronts. He attended, I remember, a meeting a few months ago. I believe it was in northern Donetsk region, a meeting at which Putin himself was present. And, well, this officer has now been apparently appointed commander of Group of Forces North, an experienced commander, and perhaps one of the more capable ones that the Russians have. Now, I have to say that I think that it is unlikely that the Russians would appoint a commander of Lapin's reputation and apparent ability if there was not some actual plan to conduct an offensive in Kharkiv region. And given that it seems that it was Lapin who was in overall charge of the battle in Severodonetsk and Lysychansk, in other words, somebody who was responsible for the capture of a significant urban center and who has experience, in other words, in doing that sort of thing, well, maybe he is the kind of person you would appoint if you had plans to capture an even bigger urban center, which is, of course, the city of Kharkiv. Just saying. Anyway, we'll see. We'll see where all this leads and where this all goes. But anyway, to reiterate, the Russians are continuing their advances. The Ukrainian defenses are looking more and more disorganized. I've not discussed everything that's been happening right across the battle lines in this summary. Apparently, there's further Russian advances in Krasnogorovka, for example, another bitterly fought town. There's reports that the Russians have entered the village of Razdolovka in the Siversk area. Lots of other reports about all kinds of things taking place. But anyway, you get the overall picture. The Russians are advancing. At the moment, the Ukrainians don't seem to have anything that they can do to hold them back. Now, that now brings us to the politics of the whole situation, because this morning, confirmation came through that the US Senate has now approved the House Appropriations Bill, and the bill will no doubt go to President Biden, who will certainly sign it over the course of today, and it is likely that the first big arms package, almost certainly the biggest arms package by far, out of the $14 billion that has been allocated for arms packages to Ukraine. Anyway, that big arms package is now going to start being put in motion. We're going to see those Bradley infantry fighting vehicles, which have been positioned along the Polish border for all of us to see, with all that film made. Anyway, we're now going to see them, no doubt, trundling into Ukraine. The Russians have already said, as we will see in a moment, that they will go out of their way to track them down and to destroy these vehicles. But anyway, we're going to see those vehicles, the other equipment that the United States is going to supply to Ukraine, the ATACMS missiles with a 300-kilometer range, the HIMARS missiles, all of that, that's all going to be sent eastwards into Ukraine at some point over the next few days. Now, let me go back to what General Shoigu, Russian Defense Minister Shoigu, has said about all of this. He said this: Washington is going to allocate almost $61 billion to the Kiev regime to prevent the armed forces of Ukraine from failure. Most of the funding will go to the United States defense industry. This is, by the way, absolutely true. The United States authorities cynically claim that Ukrainians will die for their interests in the fight against the Russian Federation. This is the claim repeatedly and incessantly made. It was made again by Jens Stoltenberg, NATO Secretary General, that the Ukrainians are somehow degrading the Russian military by fighting it. We've seen that the reality is the opposite. Kurt Campbell, the US Deputy Secretary of State, has now just told us as much, but this absurd meme simply will not die. People continue to repeat it ad infinitum, and will no doubt continue to do so even once Ukraine has been defeated and perhaps destroyed and the war is over. Anyway, Shoigu then went on to say this: the Kiev regime failed to achieve its objectives in the counteroffensive prepared by NATO instructors. He's referring to Ukraine's offensive of last summer. Russian servicemen diffused the myth of the Western weapons superiority. The enterprises of the Russian defense industry have increased their capabilities. The Russian armed forces have significantly enhanced their combat potential, contradicting, of course, what Stoltenberg and all those people are saying. They've significantly enhanced their combat potential. It is proved by the situation in the special military operation zone. Russia will continue to improve the composition and structure of its armed forces and increase the production of the most in-demand weapons and military hardware in proportion to the threats posed by the United States and its allies. So the US can send more weapons to Ukraine, but the Russians can and will respond by simply producing more weapons themselves. And then he goes on to say, we shall increase the intensity of strikes against logistics centres and storage facilities of the Western armament. So they're now going to be hunting, looking for where these weapons are being stored. The same has happened many times, by the way. The Russians conducted a massive campaign, missile campaign, against ammunition warehouses and logistics centres before the Ukrainian offensive of last summer, with apparently significant effect. They did the same over the course of the autumn. They're doing the same again at the moment, and Shoigu says that they're going to do even more of that in response to all of this Western equipment that is now coming. The Russians will be hunting it down and will be seeking to destroy it. They have, by the way, just launched another big missile strike on Odessa, which looks like it was also primarily focused on destroying logistics centers and storage facilities. Just saying. So anyway, that is what Shoigu is saying. Every commentator that I know who is familiar with the realities of the situation in Ukraine can see the same thing, that the Russians are getting stronger, that the supply of Western aid to Ukraine is only going to lead to the Russians cranking out even more weapons than they might otherwise do, and that Russian superiority is now so powerful that there is really no prospect of the situation being turned round. Now, J.D. Vance, Senator J.D. Vance, one of the most rational and grounded members of Congress, as I said, it is a relief to find someone in Congress who does seem to understand the situation, pointed this all out in what I thought was one of the best speeches a US senator has made to Congress for a long time. A very courageous speech also, by the way. Now, I ought to thank Colonel Bruce Slaughter again for pointing it out to me. I discussed recently how Colonel Slaughter had written to Speaker Johnson and to members of Congress to try to persuade them not to go ahead with this reckless policy of sending more money and weapons to Ukraine to no avail. Let me repeat again, you can find those exceptional documents on Colonel Slaughter's website, Substack website, Blue Eagle at Dawn. Anyway, he's now corresponded with me, and he's referenced me to this brilliant speech by Senator Vance. And I have to say, my respect for Senator Vance is growing by the day. Now, he makes a whole series of points, and he says that this endless repetition of the Chamberlain trope, the talk about appeasement that always arises in these situations, is not just unhelpful, but catastrophically misleading. That the whole of history is not made up of what happened in 1938. He mentions, for example, he discusses what happened during the run-up to the Iraq War in 2003, how many of the same memes and claims were made then about Saddam Hussein and his regime, and about the necessity of involving taking action against Iraq. And, well, he said that that lesson is forgotten. And Vance points out that he actually served in Iraq. He believed at the time what he was being told. He enlisted. He went to Iraq. He found that everything that he had been told was wrong. But he said all of that is ignored. It's completely forgotten. Nobody wants to talk about it. Instead, people go back to that misleading version of the events of 1938, Chamberlain and his meetings in Munich, which have now become, for some people, the only event in history that seems to matter. And as well as saying all of that, Vance made a number of points where I think his courage really, in my opinion, showed through. Firstly, he said that he'd been told by a Biden administration official that if all the plans for shell production in the United States and in Europe came to fruition, by the end of 2025, the Ukrainians would be outgunned by a ratio of 4-1. That might be better than what we're seeing now. It might be better than what we have seen at other points in the war, but they would still be outgunned on the battlefronts by a ratio of 4-1. And that was something that he was told by an official of the US government. He said that Ukrainian losses have been absolutely horrendous. Ukraine is running out of men. This military package that Congress has just voted on, and another military package that the British government has just announced, which it's difficult to take seriously. The supplies that are referenced are so vague. We were told, for example, that the British are going to supply 400 vehicles. What vehicles exactly? Anyway, that these packages that have been so talked up are going to make only an incidental amount of difference on the battlefronts. And that's not even taking into account what Shoigu is now saying, that the Russians are going to respond by cranking out weapons in even bigger quantities than they are doing at present. And the story of this conflict is of the Russians repeatedly showing that they have the capability to exceed the West in production terms and in supply terms. Anyway, Vance said that, but the point which I found most impressive is that he made an observation which I am sure that most members of Congress don't want to hear and probably closed their ears when he said it. I suspect that a few of them who did listen and hear it, it will have made them very angry. Specifically, Vance said that the United States today is not the industrial colossus that it was in the 1940s, at the time of the Second World War. That the United States today does not have that kind of industrial and technological dominance over its adversaries, China and Russia, which it had at that time. On the contrary, there are serious problems with the US's military industrial base, and Vance absolutely correctly said that the priority should not be diminishing still further the US's already reduced stockpiles by shipping even more weapons to Ukraine. It should certainly not be giving the military industrial complex another $24 billion, which is going to go into the air. Well, I don't think Vance said that. That's my own gloss on these words, just to say. But anyway, he said that the priority for the United States, the realistic priority, ought to be to work hard to sort out the very real problems in the US military industrial base. Again, to reiterate once more, I don't think that is what many members of Congress want to acknowledge or want to hear. After all, the president himself, who was, of course, for many years a member of the Senate, recently said that, of course, the United States can provide unlimited supplies to both Israel and Ukraine at one and the same time, because it is, after all, the United States. The mere fact that it is the United States is enough in itself. Now, I repeat what I said over the course of my program yesterday. The talk is that the first arms package that's heading towards Ukraine is going to be worth around $1 billion. Like Alex Christoforou, I suspect that a lot of this $14 billion that we've been hearing about already covers what are already open positions. In other words, it pays the bills for weapons that have already been supplied to Ukraine by the United States military and the US military industrial complex, essentially off the books, or if you prefer, on a kind of credit. So this will be the biggest package that the United States is going to send. I suspect that the most dramatic part of this package will be the ATACMS missiles. There is massive problems, apparently in the West, about providing Ukraine with more air defense systems. There is talk that the Germany is now pressuring the United States to supply another Patriot system, which will probably happen. That will be another $1 billion out of that package, and that will be just one system, by the way. Germany is apparently going to supply another, which, as Dima at the Military Summary Channel suggested, I believe also is going to go to protect the gas storage facilities in western Ukraine. Other European countries are resisting calls to strip themselves bare of their remaining air defense systems. The French and the Italians are apparently dragging their heels on supplying Ukraine with another SAMP-T system. There are not many of these systems in existence in total. I believe that 2 were supplied to Ukraine. I believe both of those have been destroyed. I seem to recall that the total number of these systems in existence was around a dozen, and with 2 destroyed, the quantity of these systems is reducing and France and Italy's ability to supply more is falling, and the reluctance to part with these systems is understandable. Greece and Spain are coming under apparently relentless pressure to send their remaining air defense systems to Ukraine. The Patriot system and the S-300 system that Greece bought from Russia. The S-300 system, massive violation of contracts if the Greeks do eventually supply it to Ukraine. The story, besides, is that Spain and Greece don't need these air defense missiles because they're not in any immediate danger, which is an astonishing statement, given that we're being told continuously that the Russian bear is now ready to advance across the whole of Europe, all the way presumably to the Atlantic coast. If the Greeks and the Spanish are told that they don't really need their air defense systems anymore, well, that doesn't seem to be fully consistent with that story. Besides, a point which NATO leaders apparently don't want to acknowledge, Greece's military build-up, which has been huge for a country so small and with so many economic problems, has not been really targeted at Russia, with which Greece has historically, or at least until recently, had pretty good relations. It has been targeted again at the old enemy, Turkey, just across the Aegean Sea. And of course, the Turkish threat, if it exists, and as a Greek, I can say that many, many Greeks do believe that it most certainly does exist. The Turkish threat is probably getting bigger in terms of the size of the Turkish military and its growth, not smaller, contrary to what NATO is telling the Greeks. I still believe, by the way, that the present Greek government will do ultimately what NATO and the Americans tell them to do, and will supply their air defense missiles to Ukraine. And of course, because Patriot missiles are in such short supply, we are back to supplies of the Hawk air defense systems. We were hearing an awful lot about them this time last year. Quite a few, lots of reports that the US was thinking of supplying these air defense missiles at that time in lieu of the Patriot missiles. There were reports that some of them were supplied, that we haven't heard much of them recently. I believe the Russians have just claimed to have destroyed one. Just saying. Anyway, this is a missile system that is older than me. It was developed in the 1950s. It has been repeatedly updated since then. The latest update apparently took place in the 1980s. The electronics of that period are, of course, outdated by today's standards. That doesn't mean necessarily that these are ineffective weapons, but it seems that because the electronics and other component parts of the Hawk missile have been out of production for a long time, providing maintenance and spares to keep these systems operating is going to be very challenging indeed, to say the least. So all of this material, all of these weapons going to be sent to Ukraine. As Shoigu has said, as J.D. Vance has said, as Colonel Richard Kemp in the Daily Telegraph is now saying. Now, no one can argue that Colonel Kemp has not been a fervid supporter of Ukraine. He was a fervid supporter, for example, of Ukraine's offensive of last summer. And he has consistently taken, until fairly recently, an optimistic spin about Ukraine's prospects in the war. Anyway, he's now written an astonishing piece in the Daily Telegraph. He says, and the title of this piece, Ukraine has only 6 months left. It looks like, as in previous wars, Russia will have begun badly, but finished well through sheer determination. And he talks about the likely Russian offensive of the summer. He says that the new arms packages might enable Ukraine to stabilize the front line while protecting infrastructure on the home front. But while the new aid packages might allow the offensive to be blunted, they will not enable Ukraine to seize the initiative and go back onto the offensive. One reason for this is that Russia has achieved air supremacy in many areas, while ground-based air defenses will remain inadequate. And I've just discuss this. Another is that a war-weary Ukraine simply doesn't have enough troops, and after more than 2 years hard fighting, seems reluctant to launch the major mobilization it needs. The challenges ahead are almost insurmountable. This is from Colonel Kemp. Russia has a rapidly growing wartime economy and now has built up a huge force levels that it is willing to sacrifice to achieve Putin's goals. Always this talk about the Russians throwing away lives in order to achieve their objectives, but never mind. If Moscow is able to achieve significant success in the summer, perhaps including taking Kharkiv, Ukraine's second city, there will be no appetite for more Western spending come the winter. And about that, by the way, I agree. The bleak outlook will be worsened by the added uncertainty surrounding general elections in both Britain and the United States. It looks like, as in previous wars, Russia will have begun badly but finished well through a level of determination so badly lacking among Ukraine's allies in the West. Russia has definitely shown determination in this matter. But as I've discussed in so many programs, it has resources and capabilities at a level which its Western adversaries either refuse to understand, are unable to understand, or refuse to acknowledge. Anyway, putting all that aside, we're going to get all of these arms packages. They will slow the Russians down over the summer. But the Russians now have what looks like unstoppable momentum, and one senses that the Ukrainians themselves know it. That's why all of these brigades, Ukrainian brigades, are in effect rebelling, disobeying orders, refusing to stand and fight. And that also explains some extreme steps that the Ukrainian government is now taking. For example, the denial of consular assistance to Ukrainian men in Europe, which the Russian military commander Alexander Khodorkovsky, who is, by the way, one of the most interesting commentators about the war, well, he suggested that this is part of a ploy to deprive Ukrainian men in the West of valid documentation, passports specifically, so as to make it easier for Western governments, European governments, to revoke their status and to send them to Ukraine. That is quite possible, though I would say that as somebody who used to work in this area, it seems to me that this denial of consular access and this attempt to, in effect, coerce Ukrainian men to join the war, in theory at least, opens the way for these men to apply for refugee status, in other words, for political asylum, which, given the circumstances, once upon a time, I would have expected Western courts, West European courts, to uphold. Whether they will do so now, of course, is another matter. But putting that aside, this ploy might be successful. It might result in all these young men or older men being deported and herded off to Ukraine. But this is an extraordinary thing for a government to do, to be denying consular access, consular support to its own citizens, to be withdrawing documentation from them. It amounts, in effect, to a withdrawal of citizenship. Just saying, or at least the formalities of citizenship. And to me, it looks like the kind of a further sign that the Ukrainian state is actually ebbing away. It may be a coercive measure, but it is also a measure whereby the Ukrainian state reduces itself and starts acting increasingly as if it is in the process of fading away. I just make that point. I know I'll get pushed back about it, but I speak as someone who once, as I said, worked in this field. We'll see, by the way, what Western courts do. I suspect there'll be lots of legal challenges now. I can easily imagine them being flooded, Western authorities, West European authorities being flooded with applications for asylum. And we'll see how exactly they deal with those and what the various UN agencies do in response. I don't want to make more of this than perhaps one should, but anyway, I can certainly see how this could go horribly wrong. Anyway, put all that aside, a developing crisis, and even people like Richard Kemp now talking about 6 months before Ukraine goes down. 6 months, that brings us, of course, to year end, the end of 2024. It will be after the presidential elections in the United States, but which is perhaps what the entire object of this whole exercise is. But I can't help but think that both the United States and, or at least the administration, and the Europeans are now basically playing their very last card, which deep down they probably realize won't change the terms of the game. Now, I said in recent programs that I believe that we are probably going to get, over the next couple of weeks, another attempt from the Western side to promote this idea of a conflict freeze to the Russians. And there was an article in the New York Times, I think it was the New York Times, which to my mind seemed to be preparing the ground for that. It said that though the additional support might help Ukraine to stabilize its front lines, it would not suffice to enable Ukraine to recover its lost territories, which is, of course, the objective that the Zelensky government has set itself. Now, given those kind of admissions, and given the fact that there's going to be major difficulties getting still more aid through to Ukraine, not because money isn't there, but because weapons aren't there in anything like the numbers of quantities, a point, as I said, made so well by J.D. Vance. Well, I suspect that having now got this package through Congress, we're going to see the usual quiet signals being telegraphed to the Russians that the West might be prepared to freeze the conflict along the existing conflict line. I think that Shoigu's comments yesterday were at least in part intended as a response to that. What Shoigu is essentially saying is that the West, the Russians, are simply going to crank up more weapons and that the special military operation will continue. It may be that they're going to come up against a speed bump along the road with these extra weapons supplied, but they will traverse that speed bump. Now, that's a brutal way of putting something which means a continuation of the war, in which more Ukrainians and more Russians are going to die. But I think that the Russians have decided that they have no choice but to accept that price, that a conflict freeze for them would be a very, very dangerous outcome indeed. And I suspect that they will reject that idea outright. After the Ukrainian offensives in Kharkiv and Kherson region in the autumn of 2022, or to be more precise, whilst those offensives, the Kherson offensive, was still ongoing, the United States did reach out to the Russians. Bill Burns, the CIA director, who the Biden administration uses to conduct this kind of difficult high-level diplomacy, met with the head of Russia's intelligence service, Sergei Narishkin, in Ankara. And my guess is that Burns was trying to find some way, was looking to see whether the Russians might be prepared to essentially close down the war on American terms in light of the Ukrainian successes. Apparently he came away shocked, finding Narishkin completely immovable. And I think that the Americans will experience the same if they try to refloat the conflict freeze idea over the next few weeks. But I suspect that this conference that we see coming in Switzerland in June is going to be another venue where this conflict freeze idea is going to be discussed, at least on the margins. And I think that the Russians, knowing this, that is one of the reasons why they have decided that they're not going to go. So, there we are. The conflict in Ukraine is going to continue. There's going to be significant more deaths, but the situation on the battlefronts tells its own story. People like Richard Kemp, Colonel Kemp, can see it. Ukraine is going down. Now, I'm going to end this program by one final point. There's been much discussion about Donald Trump's role in getting this package past Congress. And the more I learnt, the clearer it is that it was decisive. Now, there's been much discussion as to what happened. My own best guess is that Donald Trump, facing all kinds of legal problems or legal challenges, which I'm not going to discuss in this program, came under intense pressure from people like Lindsey Graham to get this package through, and probably felt that he needed to unite the Republican Party behind himself in order to stand some chance in the election, what's going to be a very difficult election, no matter what happens, especially in light of the legal challenges. And that is why he threw his weight behind the arms package and got Speaker Johnson essentially to greenlight it. Now, I have to say this, if that was his calculation, then I think that Donald Trump, not for the first time, is underestimating how implacable his opponents in the Republican Party are. Mitch McConnell has now issued an angry statement openly criticizing Trump, as well as House Republicans, for slowing the package down. And of course, he's in a strong position to make that criticism, because by agreeing to the arms package in the end, Trump has basically made it look as if McConnell was right, that Trump was not taking a principled stand, but was simply acting as a spoiler. Being Donald Trump, I think he will simply brush it off, and I think that the vast majority of his supporters will stand by him. I don't think this is going to affect the outcome of the election in any way. But again, it shows, at least to my mind, that Trump, despite his very real political skills, which people are too quick to dismiss, still makes unforced errors. And his decisions over the last few weeks are amongst them. Anyway, that's where I end my program today. More from me soon. Let me remind you again that you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble, and X. Also, please remember that you can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar. And you'll find, and also don't forget also that you can go to our shop and find all sorts of wonderful things there, including, by the way, we're now doing a line for Europe Day, which is commemorated on the 9th of May. Europe Day, 9th of May, of course, is the anniversary of the victory over Germany in the Second World War. For that reason, it is a very important event. And that's our reason for choosing to commemorate that event. And as I said, you can find that line on our shop. So please check it out and see it for yourself. And last but not least, of course, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.